The first thing Akelemote strapped him into the vessel was that it smelled like his mother. Not the chemical brine they used to seal the interface, not the copper and ozone of the neural mesh settling against his skull. Underneath all of it, the faint ghost of lavender soap and machine oil, the exact combination she had always carried on her hands. He knew it was a hallucination. Some frayed thread the interface pulled loose during calibration. But he did not close it off. He breathed it in and let it settle in his chest like a coal, small and hot and necessary. Outside Sizzle Bay, the world was ending. It had been ending, technically, for 11 years, since the Vrather made first contact by incinerating the northern hemisphere of Mars as a demonstration. The contact accord had bought time. 15 years of grudging coexistence under terms that grew harder to read every year, written in a language that wasn't quite language, communicated through interpreters who lost pieces of themselves with every translation. Most people called it peace. Kale's father, who had been one of those interpreters, called it a long intake of breath before a sentence no one wanted to hear. That sentence had come 2 days ago, broadcast across every human communications channel, simultaneously in perfect English, perfect Mandarin, perfect Swahili, perfect Portuguese. The instrument will now unify. Nobody knew exactly what that meant. Everyone knew exactly what it meant. The Vrather concept of unity. Kale had read everything his father had left behind, was not metaphorical. They were a hive architecture species, distributed consciousness stitched across a substrate that operated somewhere between biology and crystalline computation. To them, the isolation of individual minds was not personhood. It was a birth defect, a wound. The instrument was their correction for that wound. A convergence engine the size of a small moon, parked at the Lagrange point between Earth and its one remaining natural satellite. It had been there for 3 years, classified, at the highest levels, the kind of secret that only holds until it doesn't. Didn't anymore. Kale closed his eyes. He thought about the lavender soap. Interface at 91%, said Director Ahanu Swiftwind through the command channel. Her voice was the particular kind of flat that people use when they have already spent all their fear. And what's left is just function. Morrow, I need a verbal confirmation. I confirm, Kale said. Do you understand that synchronization above threshold will cause? I understand. A pause. Chim. He could hear her breathing. He had known Ahanu Swiftwind for 6 years, since she had pulled him out of a disciplinary review board and handed him a file that changed the shape of his life. She was not a warm person. Warmth required a kind of stillness she had never managed. But she was honest in the way that really matters, the kind of honest that costs something. Good hunting, she said. The interface went to 97%, and the world came apart. The thing no one tells you about neural mesh synchronization is how long the silence lasts before it fills. There is a moment. They called it the gap in early documentation, before the researchers ran out of adequate language, where the mind is neither inside the body nor inside the vessel. It exists in a space between states, and in that space it is absolutely alone, not lonely. Alone in the way that a single note is alone before harmony arrives. Kale had been through the gap 17 times. It was always the same. A vast, white dark silence, and the sense that if he wanted to, he could choose not to come back. He always came back. The vessel's awareness bloomed around him like a second skeleton. He felt the weight of it. 460 tons of articulate odd armor and weaponry and sensor array settle into his proprioceptive map as though he had always had it. His hands were 6 meters of tungsten alloy composite. His eyes were targeting arrays and spectral scanners, and as a depth of field that made the human visual range feel like looking through a keyhole. He could feel the magnetic gradient of the planet below him. He could feel the heat differential between the shadow of the Vrather formation and the lit side, and it was immense. The formation was not what the briefing documents had predicted. The briefing documents had predicted 12 warforms in diamond configuration. The standard Vrather offensive geometry. Standard response. Deploy 4 vessels in paired counter-geometry. Pin the formation's flanks. Force a tactical contraction. Then exploit the convergence gap when they shifted to close-range harmonics. Kyle was looking at was not 12 warforms. It was somewhere over 300. He heard the intake of breath across the command channel. Not Ahanu, she had run out of breath intakes, he suspected, days ago. The others, his wing, Petra Vasily, in Vessel Thorn, who was 23 years old and had once cried for 45 minutes, a seagull that flew into the bay window of the pilot's quarters. Marcus Osi, in Vessel Crown, who hummed music during approach runs and had never once told anyone what it was. Sarah Lindqvist, in Vessel Wire, who had grown up in a sealed habitat in Titan's northern shelf and still flinched slightly at open sky. That's not 12, Petra said. No, Kale agreed. The instrument, Marcus said. Quiet. A statement, not a question. Kale's scans confirmed it. The formation was not arranged for combat. It was arranged for protection. A sphere of 300 warforms cupped around the instrument like folded hands. The convergence engine pulsed at its center, slow and regular, a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Command, Kale said. We are looking at a protective formation around the primary objective. I am not going to pretend the standard engagement package applies here. Questing decision authority. Ahanu's response was immediate. Granted, whatever you need, whatever you need. He had been waiting, Kale realized, his entire adult life for someone to say that to him and mean it. He wished it had come in different circumstances. He looked at the formation. He looked at the instrument. His father had spent 12 years translating Vraether conceptual language and had written one sentence about the experience that Kale had memorized and never once said out loud to anyone. They do not think we are people. They think we are fragments of a person who hasn't been assembled yet, and they want very badly to finish us. Here is what I know, Kale said into the command channel. They will not fire first. The instrument needs a clean gravitational cone to function. Hostile fire in this proximity risks destabilizing their own convergence. We have a window. It's small. I'm not going to tell you how to use it. I'm going to tell you what we're doing, and then we're doing it. He heard Marcus begin to hum. Sarah went first, and she went fast. Vessel Wire was built for penetration runs. Narrower cross-section than the others. Lighter armor. Drive systems that sacrificed endurance for burst acceleration. On paper, it was the most fragile of the four. KL had watched Sarah use it in training like it was an extension of her nervous system, sliding between targeting solutions with a precision that bordered on arrogance. And he had understood then that some people find their truest selves only inside machines. She went in at an angle that, from the Vraether formation's perspective, would read as a sensor probe. Insufficient mass for a threat vector, non-threatening trajectory. She flew it loose and erratic, the way a damaged system drifts. She was counting on the Vraether failing to comprehend that a creature would fly like it was broken on purpose. They didn't comprehend it. She had 90 seconds before the formation adjusted. She used 87 of them, plants resonance disruptors, along the inner edge of the protective sphere. Each one clamped to the hull of a warform in the microsecond she passed it. Moving so fast, the docking clamps were still extending when she was already past. Kale watched her come back out of the formation and felt something he was not going to examine too closely and chose to call professional respect. 6 are down, Sarah said. Her voice was perfectly even. I mean, they're still there, just not going to be happy in about 4 minutes. Marcus hit the eastern flank while the formation was still processing Sarah's exit trajectory. He had switched off the targeting assist. Kale knew this because he had seen Marcus switch it off in every engagement they had ever shared, which drove the technical staff to a controlled fury and was operating on hand piloting and pattern recognition alone. He was also still humming. The microphones in Vessel Crown picked it up faintly and carried it across the command channel. A low, unidentifiable melody, something with an old rhythm in it. He didn't destroy anything. He wasn't trying to. He was flying the eastern edge of the formation, the way you test a wall. Pressing, at different points, watching for the places that gave slightly more than they should. He found one. He flagged it on the shared tactical feed. He pulled back before they engaged him. Soft joint, quadrant 7, he said. Structural, not firepower. It's a coordination seam. I see it, Petra said. Petra was already gone. Vessel Thorn was the oldest of the four, and also the most heavily modified. And the modifications were, technically speaking, not approved. Kale was aware of this and had chosen not to file the relevant paperwork for 3 consecutive cycles. because Petra's modifications worked, and the paperwork would have forced a review that would have grounded her for 6 months. And that was a trade he was not willing to make. The primary modification was a secondary weapons array she had designed herself over 18 months of off-hours work, built around a theoretical, on the dispersal patterns of Vreather harmonic shielding that she had submitted as a personal research paper to 3 journals, all of which had declined it. The theory was correct. She hit the coordination seam at the angle Marcus had identified, and she fired the secondary array, and the shields of 9 warforms flickered in sequence, not destroyed, just interrupted. 1.4 seconds each, cascading through the seam, like a fault line responding to pressure. 9 gaps staggered, rippling. Window, Petra said. Kale was already moving. The instrument was not what he had expected. He had seen the intelligence images. He had built models of it in his head for 3 years. All of it had been preparation for an object, a machine, something with surfaces and seams and target solutions. What he found at the center of the formation was something that resisted the category of object. His scans returned data, and the data was internally consistent, but it refused to resolve into a shape he recognized as real. It was as though the instrument existed at a slight angle to the physical, present, and yet somehow not fully committed to presence. He felt it, though. That was unexpected. Through the mesh, through the vessel's sensor skin, he felt the instrument the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not as data, but as a somatic fact, a heaviness in the chest, and behind the eyes that was almost like grief. He understood then what his father had never quite been able to translate. The instrument wasn't a weapon. It wasn't exactly an invasion tool. It was the Vreather's answer to loneliness, which was, to say, it was their answer to the human condition, offered without being asked, implemented without consent. They had looked at a species that lived and died in individual, isolated minds, and they had decided that this was a problem they could solve. A correction, an act of compassion so vast and so utterly devoid of comprehension that it was indistinguishable from extermination. He held the targeting solution for a long moment. He thought about his father, who had spent 12 years trying to explain humanity to something that did not experience humanity as a coherent category. He thought about Ahanu's voice, whatever you need. He thought about Sarah flying broken on purpose. He thought about Marcus humming. He thought about Petra, 18 months of off-hours, work on a theory that nobody had believed until it was real. He thought about all the things a mind contains that cannot be reduced to a signal. All the specific, particular, untranslatable experiences that live inside a person and do not survive dissolution. The lavender soap, the seagull, the unidentified melody. Theory submitted to 3 journals and declined by all 3. He thought, we are not fragments. We are already whole, he fired. The resonance disruptors went off first, and the 6 warforms they were attached to shook apart their own shielding, trying to compensate, which created a cascading interference pattern that spread faster than the formation's coordination could manage. This was Sci-Fi's contribution. She had calculated the cascade geometry 3 days ago on a napkin, and had not mentioned it was a napkin until Kale asked for the source file. The formation began to contract. This was expected. Protective sphere takes damage at the inner edge. The instinctive Vreather response is to tighten, to close the breach by reducing circumference. It was a sound tactical instinct. It was also exactly what they needed it to do. Marcus hit the soft joint at the moment of maximum contraction, when the mass of 300 warforms was compressing inward and the coordination seam was at its widest and most vulnerable. Not firing, not attacking, just driving vessel crown directly through the gap at full acceleration. A physical interruption of the coordination network, a body in the machine. He came out the other side trailing Vreather's sensor fire. And what might have been the alien equivalent of alarm. He was still humming. The formation split, not evenly, not cleanly, but split, which was enough. Petra went through the split with the secondary array firing in the precise pattern she had published in a paper. Nobody had believed. And the harmonic shielding on the warforms she passed folded like wet paper. Not destroyed but disrupted, temporarily blind and deaf, holes punched in the formation's perception. Kale went through the holes. He had made a targeting solution in the 3 seconds before Marcus breached the coordination seam, and he had refined it in the 2 and tapped in the 2 seconds. Marcus was transiting, and he had locked it in the 1 second. Petra's disruption opened in the lanes. 5 seconds of preparation for a firing sequence that lasted 0.7 of a second. He hit 4 structural nodes at the instrument's cardinal points simultaneously. Not the engine core. He didn't know enough about the core to be confident a hit wouldn't do something worse than activate it. But the nodes were the mechanism by which the instrument maintained its orientation relative to Earth's gravitational gradient. Without orientation, without the precise alignment of its convergence cone, it couldn't function. It would just be a very large, very expensive, very confused piece of Rather engineering sitting at a Lagrange point. The instrument went dark, not exploded, not destroyed, dark, offline, present, and yet suddenly not fully committed to presence, in a new and different way. The formation stopped moving. That was the moment KL had not been sure about. Whether, when the instrument went offline, the Vrathier would respond with fury or with something else. He had spent a lot of time thinking about it, and had arrived at no satisfying answer, and had decided in the end that it didn't matter, because the other options were worse. They responded with stillness. 300 warforms, frozen in whatever configuration the contraction and disruption and Petra's secondary array had left them in, and silence across every spectrum, not the silence of preparation. The silence of something that has encountered a variable it does not have a framework for. Command, Kale said. The instrument is offline. Formation has halted. I am not reading any active targeting. Do you want me to engage? A very long pause. No, Ahanu said. Her voice had changed. The function flatness was still there. But underneath it now was something that he recognized distantly as the particular sound of a person who is not going to cry and knows they are not going to cry and has made peace with what that costs. Hold position. I'm getting reports that the convergence signal has dropped globally. The instrument was already broadcasting. We didn't know. We didn't know it was already broadcasting. What does that mean? It means it started earlier than we thought. It means some people may have already. She stopped. We're doing assessments. Hold position. Kale held position. He looked at the 300 still warforms around the dormant instrument, and he felt the pressure behind his eyes that was almost like grief, and he thought, you wanted to fix us. You looked at individual minds, separate and isolated and capable of loss, and you wanted to fix that. You thought you were being kind. He wanted to tell them. He had no way to tell them. The interface, in any case, didn't work that direction. Sarah came alongside Vessel Command and matched his drift. I've been running numbers, she said, after a while. Don't tell me if they're bad numbers. They're complicated numbers. He waited. Cact. The broadcast reached approximately 8% of the global population before we shut it down. Based on the partial data the command network has been able to aggregate in the last, she paused. 22 minutes, it appears that the effect is not, actually, irreversible. In the physiological sense, the convergence process requires sustained signal to complete. We interrupted it. People who were in early-stage exposure are reporting disorientation and sensory disruption, but coherence is returning. And the ones in late stage. A shorter pause this time, still assessing. He closed his eyes. He thought about 8% of the global population. He thought about what it would feel like to have the edges of yourself begin to dissolve, to feel the boundaries between your thoughts and someone else's thoughts soften, and then blur, and then, if the signal had run long enough, disappear. He thought about what might or might not come back once the signal was gone. He thought about what his father had written. They think we are fragments of a person's who hasn't been assembled yet. Thing is, Kale thought, and he had thought this for years and had never said it out loud to anyone, not because it was secret, but because it was the kind of thought that requires the right moment and the right silence. And those had never quite arrived until now. The thing is, we are fragments. Everyone is. Every mind is an incomplete and partial construction, a story that is still being told, a person who hasn't finished becoming. That's not the defect. That's the mechanism. You finish becoming by making contact with other incomplete constructions, by colliding and abrading and sometimes fusing and sometimes simply existing alongside. By the accumulated particular friction of other people, which hurts, which is sometimes more than you can stand, and which is the only thing that actually makes you more than what you started as. That's not a wound that needs fixing. That's the whole point. He didn't say any of this. Sarah was running numbers, and Petra was running a damage assessment on the secondary array. And Marcus had finally stopped humming and was very quietly singing something in a language Kale didn't recognize. And across the command channel, Ahanu was coordinating triage, her voice flat and steady and relentlessly functional. And all of them were doing what the moment required, which was the most human thing Kale could think of. He looked at the dormant instrument. He looked at the still formation. They're not going to reactivate it, he said. He didn't know how he knew this. He knew it. What makes you think that? Sarah asked. Because it didn't work, Kale said. And they don't have a framework for that. And they're going to need time to build one. And that's time we can use. He paused. Tell Command we need a xenolinguistics team. And we need to restart the translation program, the good version, with actual funding. And we need someone who will actually sit with them, not to manage them, to talk to them, to be willing to be confused and wrong and to try again. That's not a military recommendation. No, it's not. Another pause. He heard Sarah breathing through the command channel, slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone who has just come out of penetration, run through 300 war forms, and is choosing not to perform how close that was. I'll pass it up, she said. Thank you. The debrief was 3 hours, and then 4 more, and then a recess that lasted 6 hours, during which Kale sat on the floor of the pilot's preparation room and ate something that was technically food, and tried to remember the last time he had been fully horizontal. Ahanu found him there. She sat down on the floor beside him without preamble, which was either a sign that things were very bad, or a sign that the moment had passed some threshold of formality that made sitting on floors appropriate. The late-stage number, she said. Tell me. 6,000 approximately. We're still counting. Of those, roughly 400 show complete coherence loss. The signal ran long enough to complete the convergence. The rest are in various stages of partial effect. She looked at her hands. The 400. We don't know yet. We genuinely don't know. There are things that look like awareness. There might be something to work back from. Kale thought about 400 people. We'll find out, he said. Try. That's all we can do. It usually is. He thought about his father again. He thought about 12 years of translation work, and one sentence. They think we are fragments of a person who hasn't been assembled yet, and they want very badly to finish us. His father had said it without anger. He had understood. This was the remarkable thing, the thing that had taken Kale years to fully understand. He had understood that the Vrethir were not malicious. They were alien, which was different and more complicated. You can reason with malice. You can negotiate with malice. Genuine, thorough architectural alienness is something else. It requires a different kind of patience, a patience built less on tolerance than on genuine curiosity. The willingness to be confused for a very long time before anything starts to make sense. His father had had that kind of patience. He had run out of time to use it. The translation program, Ahanu said. I'm hearing you. You talked to Sarah. She's not wrong. Military solutions have a ceiling. We hit the ceiling today. We need something that doesn't have a ceiling. She looked at him. I'm also hearing that you want to be involved. I'm a terrible diplomat. You're a terrible diplomat, and you speak 17 words of functional Vrethir conceptual language, which is 17 more words than anyone else on this station. She paused. Father was a good man. He was a frustrated man, Kale said. He spent 12 years trying to explain things and ended up with one sentence. One sentence that is more accurate than most of what our analysts have produced in the intervening 11 years. They sat for a while on the floor of the preparation room. Somewhere outside, the night shift was running sensor sweeps over the dormant instrument. And the 300 war forms had not moved. And Earth's population was slightly stock of how many of them had answered a signal. They hadn't understood and come partway back from a dissolution that had been offered as a gift. Do they want? Asanu said after a long time. Not a rhetorical question, an actual one. Kale thought about it. I think they want what we want, he said. They just have a completely different answer for what that is. He paused. They're lonely. In their architecture, a cyclation is, I don't know if it's pain exactly. It's probably more like a constant low-frequency wrongness. Like living with a sound you can't turn off. They found a species of 300 million isolated fragments, and they wanted to do something about it. So they tried to dissolve us. They tried to solve us. He felt the distinction was important, even if the outcome would have been identical. The question is, whether there's a version of connection they can understand that doesn't require the dissolution of individuals. Whether there's something we can offer that addresses their actual problem without erasing ours. Is there? He thought about Sarah's numbers, and Marcus's humming, and Petra's 18 months of off-hours theory work, and his father's 12 years of translation, and the lavender soap, and the seagull, and the specific untranslatable texture of each of those things. I don't know, he said honestly. But I think the only way to find out is to actually try, not manage. Actually try. Ahanu looked at him for a long time. I'm going to put you in a room with a xenolinguistics team and a communications array pointed at the Vrathier formation, she said. And I am going to give you 6 months and whatever resources you need. And then I am going to need results. Not solutions, results. Measurable progress toward a framework. Can you do that? Kale thought about his father. He thought about the sentence. Yes, he said. The first contact session was 7 weeks of feast. After the linguist had rebuilt the translation architecture from scratch, using everything his father had left behind, plus 3 years of intercepted Vrathier communications that had sat in a classified archive, because nobody had known what to do with them. The Vrathier response to the outreach query had taken 4 days to arrive. It was long, complex, and significantly above their current translation capacity. What they could extract from it, with confidence, amounted to acknowledgement, received, inquiry, what are you? Inquiry, how do the fragments speak? Kale had drafted the response himself in consultation with the team. It had taken 9 days and 11 complete revisions. The final version was 3 conceptual statements. Stated, we are the fragments you observed. We speak as fragments. This is not a defect. The second stated, we observe that you experience our fragmentary state as incomplete. We observe that you wish to address this. We observe that the address was not consented to. The third statement took the longest to write because the concept did not exist in Vrathier conceptual language, and they had to build it from components. Assembling something new from available parts, the way you assemble a sentence in a language that doesn't have the word you need. The third statement said, approximately, we can show you what a fragment contains, not merge, show. There is a difference. Pose this exchange, because what we have found is that the exchange itself, the showing, the contact across the boundary, the fact of one incomplete thing genuinely encountering another incomplete thing, is not a lesser version of what you experience in convergence. It is a different version. We believe it is worth your consideration. The response from the Vrathier took 11 days. It was, as far as the translation team could determine, a question. The question was, show us. The program Kale designed over the following months was unglamorous, expensive, frequently confusing, and entirely unlike anything that had been proposed in the 11 years of contact accord negotiations. He brought in musicians and engineers and poets, and a marine biologist from Titan, who had studied isolation responses in bioluminescent organisms, and whose particular way of thinking about signals turned out to be unexpectedly useful. He brought in a woman named Ohana Reyes, who had been in early-stage convergence exposure when the instrument activated, and who had come back coherent, and with a description of what it had felt like that, when translated, produced the first Vrathier conceptual statement anyone had ever generated that the Vrathier communication channel flagged as priority acknowledged. She described it as hearing a voice that was also all voices, and said the hardest part was not that it felt bad. The hardest part was that it felt like something she had been looking for, without knowing she was looking for it. She said she had chosen to come back anyway. And that was not because the merged state was wrong, but because she had things she had not finished yet. Things that were specifically hers, and would not survive the dissolution. And she was not willing to surrender them. Not yet, not like that. When they translated this and transmitted it, the Vrathier response time dropped from 11 days to 4. Kale thought his father would have appreciated that. The final communique from the Vrathier High Convergence, which was not technically a governing body, but was the closest analog to one that their architecture produced, arrived 7 months after Kale's program began. It was not a peace treaty. Neither side had the framework for a peace treaty yet. It was something more preliminary, an acknowledgement of bilateral uncertainty, an admission, in Vrathier conceptual language, that the category of being they had encountered did not fit the existing taxonomies, and that the existing taxonomies might therefore require revision. An expression of what the translation team spent 2 weeks arguing over before settling on the closest available English rendering. Something between curiosity and grief, directed at the fact that individual minds end. We observe, the communique said, that the fragments complete. We observe that this is permanent. We do not understand the choice to remain separate given this. We wish to understand. Kale wrote the response himself, in the middle of the night, without consulting the team first. He sent it to Ahanu for review, and she sat with it for 6 hours and came back and said, "Send it." Response said, "We don't always choose it. We are built this way, and some of what we build while we are this way could not exist otherwise. We agree this is worth understanding together. We have time." They sent it. 7 months and 11 days after the instrument went dark, the Vrathier formation began, slowly, to rearrange itself. Not into an offensive geometry, not into a defensive sphere, into something the translation team's xenoarchitecture consultant, after 3 hours of analysis, described carefully as an open configuration. Receptive. Waiting. "What does that mean?" Ahanu asked. "It means they want to talk," said the consultant, "not merge." "Talk?" Ahanu looked at Kale. Kale thought about his father. He thought about 12 years and 1 sentence, and about all the things a mind contains that cannot be reduced to a signal, and about the lavender soap, and Saris's napkin geometry, and Marcus's unidentified melody, and Petra's declined theory that turned out to be right. He thought, this is not the end. This is nowhere near the end. There is an enormous amount of work left to do, most of it confusing and expensive and unglamorous, and the outcome is not guaranteed, and the cost is not known, and the framework doesn't exist yet, and will have to be built from scratch the way you build a sentence, in a language that doesn't have the word you need. He thought, good. "Tell them we're coming," he said. He walked back to the prep bay. He sat down in the vessel's interface cradle. He let the calibration run. He breathed through the gap. The white dark silence, the aloneness that was not loneliness, the moment of being between states where you could, if you wanted, choose not to come back. He always came back. And underneath the chemical brine and the copper and ozone, very faint, almost gone, lavender soap and machine oil, he carried it into the dark like a coal, small and hot and necessary. He went to talk.